So let's go ahead and bring the next guest on. Hello, Barry. How are you?
Well, hi, Justin. It's nice to see you.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, no worries. I hope Nicole's there as well. She's going to handle my slides since I had a little technical problem on my end. Never good for a technology company, but it's operator error, not the company.
No, Nicole's here making sure everything's going well, so no worries there.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Barry.
Great. So did you want me to just get going then, Justin?
Yes, go ahead. I hand it off to you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for having me and welcome everyone. I know we only have a brief period of time here, but the corpus of my discussion with you all today is around the convergence of DeFi and TradFi. And is it really happening? Isn't it really happening? What are some of the myths that are out there? What are some of the misnomers? And what does it really mean for the future? And I guess because it would be impossible to have a conversation without talking about the shop that I work at, a little bit about Algorand and the technology that we've created and how it legs into some of this. So without further ado, I will kind of move right into a little bit of the background on Algorand and go forward from there. And I should probably just start by saying my background is I was a 30-plus year Wall Street guy, came to Algorand very organically through some people I knew in business who suggested it was wonderful technology. I agreed with them after a small bit of time with the company, and I've come on to, as Justin said, head up business development here in the North American region. Although it does cross over and around the globe, to be perfectly candid. It's just the nature of the beast. So, all right, let's talk about Algorand real quick, and we'll get through that commercialization part of it. So Algorand was, if you go to the next slide, Nicole, was founded by Silvio Micali, arguably the modern day father of cryptography. He's a Turing Award winner, a Global Prize and RSA Award winner as well. His work on things like zero knowledge proofs and verifiable random functions is the cornerstone to much of the work that other blockchains are built on and the like. So he stands quite renowned throughout the space. And it was his finding of Bitcoin and Ethereum and being very impressed by those different protocols and was really interested in it, that he and his team then sought to look into it deeper, thought that there was something that could be done to improve upon what was currently being done there. And he set out to do just that with a DARPA grant in hand. The team ultimately set out to prove, and they did, that the trilemma that existed between scalability, security, and decentralization, which heretofore had thought could not exist in the same room together, could actually exist. You did not have to give up one of the three. And that is what ultimately became the foundation for what we now know as Algorand. Next slide, Nicole. So what did it result in? It resulted in the creation of the Algorand pure proof of stake, which differs from other things like proof of work and delegated proof of stake and bonded proof of stake. And the reason why that becomes very important as we get deeper into this conversation is because it allows for the most scalability, which allows for the greatest decentralization, which, as we know, this is a conversation built around DeFi. The D of that, which we'll talk about in a moment, is decentralization in that example. Next slide, please, Nicole. So this protocol and technology that was developed here at Algorand proved out to be incredibly scalable with virtually no limitations whatsoever. It's incredibly fast. It's ridiculously secure and unattackable because it has complete finalization, and it was both environmentally efficient and incredibly cost efficient as well. And when you put all that together, you have something that can be scaled to billions of potential users and done at a very low cost, which becomes incredibly important when we start to talk about things like DeFi applications. So next slide quickly. And just to sort of finish up a bit on the Algorand PR here. So Algorand started by building an ecosystem that has now expanded to nearly 800 different entities that are all engaged in all different parts of the cap stack and all parts of the line that is necessary to start from a technological and development perspective all the way out to payments and the like, and everything in between, so that everything can operate efficiently on the blockchain. So DeFi and TradFi, what's the main commentary there? So if we can go to the next slide. So this is myth number one. Myth number one is that, similar to when the peer-to-peer lending business began a few years back with Lending Club and Prosper, and everyone was up in arms that this would mean the end of the banking lending business as we knew it, that turned out to be a bit of a wrong statement. And so now the new statement is DeFi is going to spell the end of the traditional finance industry, at least as we know it. And as Mark Twain once said, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So has that statement, in my humble opinion. In fact, quite to the opposite, I would argue that the traditional financial entities of the world are starting to lean into what's happening in DeFi and take advantage and wanting to learn more about the different technologies that are available to them out there to improve on not only the performance, but the services and how their businesses can grow and prosper in this new generation of technological wizardry that we all know as being the blockchain. Now, with all that said, you have to remember that the whole concept here for TradFi is to ultimately try to democratize as much of the financial industries as possible and get to a larger and larger audience, both from an origination perspective and a placement perspective and all the different areas in between. And some would argue that, well, that means they're going to, by definition, be cutting themselves out of the picture, but that doesn't really serve its purpose here. In fact, what they are doing in more cases than not is finding ways to tackle different areas that they can service better than a non-traditional financial institution might be able to. And as I said earlier, they're learning how to lean into this technology and take advantage of it. Myth number two, if we go ahead one slide, is that that both DeFi and TradFi are focused on the same outcomes. And that's not accurate. It's not entirely untrue either, but it's not accurate. The DeFi community, at least currently, is extremely focused, as I think the previous presenter had mentioned, on yield and creating return for the investor base that's there. And that's a fair statement, and that's what it's being used for currently, and is doing it quite well for that matter. The traditional financial industry, however, thinks first and foremost about tail risk and making sure that whatever they're engaged in has all aspects of it covered. Well, that's a very important distinction, because one can easily search for yield at the risk of forgetting about the ultimate tail risks. And to date, that's been a bit of the way of the world. And the problem with that is that you can do that for as long as you want until it's too late. And so until there's a meeting of that, TradFi will never fully accept where the world of DeFi is until they can feel comfortable. And what's the best way to do that? Well, we're going to talk about that momentarily. So next slide, Nicole. So then we have to look at what is decentralized finance. Well, it's made up of two worlds: finance, very easy, and decentralization. But is it really decentralized? I would argue that the answer to that question is no. In fact, it's not completely decentralized at this point. And in fact, if you look at the different ways that it's being used, currently there's greater amounts of centralization than will ultimately be the case going forward. But decentralization is ultimately the key to the success that will come in the world of DeFi as we get further and further down this path. And the reason for that is because decentralization becomes, as it is a central tenet to the Algorand platform, becomes your greatest form of preventing that tail risk. Well, if we're preventing that tail risk, we have now brought TradFi back into the conversation. And when TradFi meets DeFi, that's when you've got the greatest power available to you. If we could switch to the the next slide there, Nicole? Great. And so here's why I say what I did just now. So in any platform, you've got users and you've got validators. And so in the current platforms that are being used with great regularity in the world of DeFi, there is more of a sense of centralization than ultimately one would want to have there. So whether it is a POW, a DPoS, or a PPoS, meaning proof of work and the different types of proof of stakes, you've got users and you've got securers of the network. And the fewer securers of the network vis-a-vis the number of users of the network, the more congested is the centralization. And that's not ultimately a good thing for blockchain, where decentralization truly means that more of the users of the network are themselves the secure networks, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that they ultimately create a much more decentralized universe. And as I mentioned before, a decentralized universe is one in which it has a greater lack of tail risk associated with it. And so the benefit of that is that TradFi and DeFi then meet together, and you can have the explosion of all the things that we've wanted for this to move to in the future. Next slide, Nicole. So that gets us to where do TradFi and DeFi seem to come together. And the way to think about where they're going to come together is by thinking about the differences that they currently have today. And the reality is there are differences that exist, but those differences, as they start to be eliminated, they start to converge and one become equivalent to the other. So let's take a look at traditional finance, and you realize that it's incredibly expensive, the world of traditional finance. There's tons and tons of people in between every transaction, from a simple transaction where you're just cashing a check to bringing billions of dollars of capital to an organization, and then everything else that's in between those things. There's a lot of costs and a lot of different middle persons involved in that. The time to settle for all these transactions, while it's decreased tremendously, certainly, it still is far greater than the world would like to be in a world that is technologically advanced now, that it could be T plus measured in seconds. And in traditional finance, you also have a lot of counterparty risk because there's a time delay between anyone putting up their capital and receiving the goods that are ultimately requested or required. And of course, as we know, traditional finance is by definition currently a very centralized meeting place and all. All those elements that I just said can be addressed in a DeFi world. And you'll be hearing and have heard, I'm sure, time and time again now from different speakers about how DeFi is starting to do that. It's really focused right now in one particular area, which is adding passive income and yield, but it can really run the gambit of all different type of financial applications. And that is starting to happen with great regularity. And you'll see it even more so as more digital assets start to come on chain, which I think before the end of this year, you'll see some pretty significant digital asset creation and deployment on chain, certainly by Algorand, where we expect that you'll be seeing quite a bit of that too. So Nicole, if we could go to the next slide. So here's three major areas where TradFi and DeFi can really work together. One is capital raising that we talked to about moments ago. This DeFi allows us to get to corners of the earth that people never expected to. It allows us to start banking the unbanked, which has always been a want as the traditional financial community has wanted to democratize and spread their wings in terms of their placement. And the costs associated in between decrease tremendously. So I forget the exact statistic, but it's a fairly large amount of unbanked people just in the US alone, let alone across the globe. And a world of DeFi eliminates that and reduces it tremendously. Liquidity, by very definition, that's what you see in the DeFi world today, is creating the movement of capital at a breakneck speed, allows you to go cross-border, allows you to grow cross-currency in an exceptionally expedient way, and efficiently at extremely low cost. And these are things that the traditional finance market has been seeking for years and years. And then as the development of secondary market trading occurs, it becomes another form of revenue generation for the traditional financial institutions to start participating in that. And you're already seeing much of that starting to be thought about just even in the native currency trading that's going on with different large investment banks and so forth, starting to create trading desks and custody operations and the like. I just wanted to point out a couple of, the next slide, Nicole, before I open up for Q&A, just a couple of things that you may have seen recently on Algorand, which are some DeFi projects that have come to bear. I'll leave it for you all to read about any of these. You can certainly go to www.algorand.com and look under our use cases and call up any one of these. But they're all built around the DeFi uses that you're seeing now, their DEXs, their liquidity pools, and the like. And so the future is just wide open for where these applications will happen. But at its very cornerstone, in order for DeFi to really take off, it requires for the blockchains to maintain as much decentralization as possible. In order for that to occur, you need the right type of technology. And that's where we do believe that Algorand is offering up that type of an alternative via its pure proof of stake capabilities. I'm going to now leave it for a Q&A. I did add one appendix in here, which I don't know if you all get the presentation or not, but it just talked about some of the technological advances that Algorand has made in its layer one functionality, which is Algorand standard assets, which is the equivalent of tokens or ERC20s, if you will, as an example, and standard Algorand standard contract, smart contracts, and the capability of doing atomic transfers, which happen immediately without any delay. All those things are occurring at layer one, and they all benefit from the exact same governance as the native token does. So there is no need to rebuild any of that at a layer two or through any additional smart contract technology. It all already exists within layer one and Algorand. And so things like clawback and freezing and whitelisting and so forth, those things all exist at layer one and allow for great ease of use for DeFi projects that are building out there as well. So with that said, Justin, I'll leave it to you to open it up to Q&A if we have anything that wants to be asked.
Yes, absolutely. Like a leprechaun, I appear when you say the phrase "time to take questions." So sorry, I stepped on your last slide there.
That's totally fine. I just realized how much time I had left, which wasn't much.
So we've just got 3 minutes, so I want to get through some questions. You're talking about the focus on decentralization right now as being essential to DeFi's continued growth. How is Algorand, for our audience, not only of investors but also potentially of developers? What do we need to understand about Algorand as being, an alternative to Ethereum with what the clear benefits that go along with that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Justin. So look, here's I'll just give you some real highlight numbers. So Ethereum currently, in order to settle a contract to finality, well, let's just talk about transactions per second, might be, call it 10 to 15 transactions per second. I might be being generous there. Algorand, it's 1,200 transactions per second. Shortly, that'll be upgraded to 10,000 transactions per second. And by the end of the year, first quarter of next year, that'll be upgraded to 46,000 transactions per second, all being done with block propagation occurring in less than 4.5 seconds, which is, you're measured in minutes on Ethereum as an example, and to finality, to be comfortable that it's really been validated properly, you're probably going to wait anywhere from 15 minutes to 30 minutes and so forth. Further, the cost of any transaction done on Algorand never changes. It's 0.001 algos, which as of today means it's roughly 0.00115 dollars, as opposed to it could be as much as $100 per transaction on Ethereum. Algorand has been proven by third-party verification to independent verification that it cannot fork it does not fork, and that its blocks are completely final at time of propagation, which means it's effectively unattackable. So it's never had a downtime in its entire 2.5 years of since launch existence. It's, I think, the only chain that can make that claim. It's certainly one that runs at this type of number of transactions and all. So you add all that up, and it becomes a pretty unique scenario. Further, the way that the validation process and the block propagation exists is that everyone who owns an algo has the right to be a validator, right? Which means they have the right to be a secure. So if you remember my chart that showed the bubbles coming on top of each other, that means it has the greatest amount of decentralization. In a proof of work scenario like in Ethereum, yes, there's lots of nodes out there, but the reality is because you need so much power, they're all sitting in one area or multiple, and so they're very apt for potential attack because of it, let alone the cost associated. So those are some of the obvious highlights there.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Barry. We're going to move on to our afternoon keynote, but thank you very much for coming on to tell us about Algorand.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if anybody wants to reach out, you can reach me, Barry@algorand.com.
All right, perfect. We just put the URL up for you. All right, good talking to you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.